This is the most challenging and yet the most rewarding part of the rod building process, which is the varnishing. Again, I do it slightly differently to a lot of other people you will have seen on YouTube. Starting at the beginning, the most important thing with varnishing is you have a clean environment. It's absolutely critical. Now, obviously, I don't expect any of you to have a clean room and a fairly dusty workshop, probably. I've got fume and dust extraction units in my workshop in here, but you clearly won't have. The best thing to do to get a clean environment is to make sure that nobody has been in a room for at least 6 hours. Anybody will know on a very bright day, you look out of the window and all you can see are millions of particles of dust and tiny hairs floating around. They are, your wet wraps are a magnet for those. And the way you disperse them is make sure nobody's been in the room for some time, and then boil a kettle with the lid off for about 4 minutes, depending on the size of the room. And what will happen is that you've now effectively filled the room with steam. Shut the door, let that settle, and it will take all the dust particles out of the air with it. So at least you're not, you've erased or eradicated one problem already. The next problem is more difficult, which is the problem of getting bubbles in the mixture or the varnish as and when it's gone on. And there are two ways you get bubbles, or 2 or 3 ways you get bubbles into a varnish. The first is through mixing. So as you're mixing air in, and those bubbles, due to the viscosity of most varnishes, will just stay there. The second problem is using one of those, which introduces bubbles into the varnish, which is a bit pointless. So once you've mixed it, you then pick it up with that, and yet you've got more bubbles going in onto the wrap. The third problem is that the thread contains air, and as soon as you put varnish onto it, the thread will start to disperse air, which gets trapped in the mixture, and if it sets like that, gives you a horrible finish with loads and loads of bubbles. Most people seem to have found a way out of getting the bubbles out using hair dryers, alcohol burners, matches, lighters, everything, you name it, everything. Vacuum chambers, there's another one. My solution is very simple. Engineer the problem out before you start. Don't use a brush to start with, although I will for the first coat, and I'll explain why in just a second. Do wear gloves. This isn't a COVID statement. I've been working with epoxy for over 20 years, and the number of times I've been dripped on my skin is now basically allergic to epoxy resin, and I come out with a bad case of dermatitis. The other thing you can use in place of a brush is a small spoon. I've had this for 25 years. It's been repaired, broken, repaired. You can use a spatula, you can use a knife, you can use a small Victorian salt cellar spoon, you can use a cocaine spoon, readily available on eBay, not big money. But try not to use a brush unless it's for the first coat. And the reason I use a brush for the first coat is I thin my coat down. And the reason I thin the coat down, the first coat down, is I want to seal that thread. So I'll put a very thin, watery finish on that thread, which I'll then let to set. It doesn't actually have to be set solid, just leave it 4 hours. 8 hours is a normal curing time. Leave it for 4 hours, and then you can come back to doing your second part of the mix. There's a simple way of doing it. First thing is get a good varnish. This is our varnish we buy in from Japan, called Sensei, which we sell in small packs just so somebody can build 1 or 2 rods with. And it is the best varnish I've ever come across, and I've used them all. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start, to drip a bottle, I'm going to start by dripping, just in this case, 10 drops of part A. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then 10 drops of part B. Make sure these are quite warm when you use them. Either bung them in the microwave literally for 3 seconds or stand them up in a cup of hot water. So now goes my 10 drops of the second one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Right. And now to that, I'm going to add double the amount of both in isopropyl alcohol. So I've now got 20 drops in there. So I'm going to add 40 drops of isopropyl alcohol. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. It doesn't have to be that precise. Keep a bit spare just in case you need it and you haven't added enough. Now I am going to mix it with a brush because I know that there's quite a lot of alcohol in there, and it will thin it down fairly quickly. And once it's become really thin, the bubbles will just pop out. The problem with getting you can see I'm getting bubbles in the mix, but I'm not bothered about that because I know that they will, due to the fact that this is so thin, they will just pop out. The problem with mixing like that, if you hadn't have thinned it down, is those bubbles will get trapped in the mixture and you'll never get them out. So I'm going to put a little bit more in. You might find, see if I can get it to do it, you might find this goes cloudy if you add too much isopropyl. Don't worry, if you keep mixing, it will go off. Now, I'm pretty confident that this will work with most of the proprietary varnishes or polyurethane varnishes that are on the market, epoxy resins. I happen to know that the Sensei that we use it is really, really good. At not being mixed correctly, so part A and part B, if they're not mixed correctly on a lot of varnishes, the varnish will never go hard. And B, it seems to enjoy being mixed up with a whole load of alcohol. You possibly, hopefully you can see the bubbles are just, they're bursting out of that. And if I just give it a shake and then blow it, most of those bubbles will be gone. Now what I'm going to do is I want to seal or coat that wrap completely, and it'll soak in. At this point I'm not going over the edges, I'm just intending to get as much into it as I can so that the thread is completely impregnated on the first coat. When you finish this, I mean that looks okay, but a lot of the times it looks bloody awful, but don't worry. It's there to do a job. It's not supposed to be cosmetic at the moment, and you know you just want to make sure that those wraps are fully coated. I've got this on a turner at the moment, but you don't need to. You can, and a lot of the time, if I'm working in another room, I just do it by hand when I finish the wrap, and just spin it round with the brush against it, or just let it all soak in like I've done there. And now what I'd do is I'd leave that to set. Tack free, or not completely set, which would take 8 or 9 hours at 20 degrees air temperature. Because by the time it's actually started to harden, it's done its job. So you can then come back. And when I go through, put the second coat on, I go through exactly the same process. I still mix the isopropyl in. And I use these shot glasses, which I bought on Amazon, I think it was, just to keep the dust out. And I just loosely put them on. I don't seal them shut because obviously the alcohol wouldn't evaporate out. So I mix 10 drops part A, 10 drops part B, 40 drops or between 40 and 60 drops of isopropyl, and then either cover that with a light cloth and leave it, because there are no bubbles in that at the moment, and that's how I want to keep it. And what will happen in about 2 hours is that will be the same viscosity as the two originals, because the alcohol will have evaporated out of it. But at least I'm starting with a bubble-free epoxy before I put it on. I know that that will solve the problem. That has solved the problem. And now when I go to the second coat, and here's one I prepared earlier, as they say. When I go to the second coat, you can see the viscosity of that is an awful lot thicker, but no bubbles. Put it in my magic ashtray. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my spoon, I'm going to dip it in and hold it underneath this wrap and let the wrap pick it up. Now obviously I haven't varnished this one, this hasn't had a first coat on it, so it may well throw out a few bubbles, but this is just to demonstrate. A lot of the time, a lot of people aren't as considerate as this and don't mind a few bubbles in their wrap as long as it looks fairly even. I'm a bloody perfectionist, so I like everything to be as good as it gets. So I'm just going to coat that on again, starting on the thread. Don't go out of the thread yet. And just make sure that it doesn't matter if it drips off at this stage. Just make sure you've got as much on that as you can. And even though it's coating, it obviously, if that had had a first coat, it wouldn't have absorbed it. So I'm going to have to build it up a little bit. It really is equally important that you try and either buy, and we sell them on our eBay shop, bog standard pack bay turner, which is this unit here, and a support bracket, or you can make one yourself. I know people that have made them from can opener motors, microwave motors, what's the other one? An electric drill with a slow speed setting mounted on a concrete block. Okay, so now I've got a fair amount on there. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to come from the centre out, so that I want to get onto the blank and just drop onto the blank like that and put a tiny, tiny, thin wrap just off the thread and onto the blank, and this will seal it properly. And in fact, with this spoon, I've actually sharpened one edge to do this, so I don't get too fatter amount, or too thick an amount, too thick an amount on the blank. That's what I'm trying to say. There we go. Now, because this hasn't had an undercoat, I can see that it needs a little bit more because there are some bare threads. Not many, but there are some bare threads in amongst it. And keep an eye on it for 5 minutes, just to make sure that it's smooth all the way round and that you're happy with it. And at this point you can leave it. However, if you don't want to invest in a turner, you'll have to do it by hand, which means you're going to have to put it on, spinning the blank or getting somebody else to spin the blank, and then you're going to have to sit there for probably 3 hours and turn it. You can always, sit and watch telly, but it's a bloody laborious process. So for 48 quid, buying one of these rod turners is a much better idea. I'm quite happy with that, bearing in mind it didn't have a first coat on it. And I would probably wait to see what would happen to that. And if it did need a second coat, I would go back to my original thin mix and just put a very, very thin coating on it. But the most important thing is there are no bubbles in that wrap. Because the mixture actually has been quite thin. There are no bubbles in that wrap because that's now sealed. So I haven't introduced any bubbles into this by using a brush. If I'd have used a brush and dipped it in the varnish and then put it on, I'd get bubbles. And sandblasting it with a hairdryer is a pretty stupid idea, to be candid. All you do is blow dust into it, and trying to get the bubbles to pop out using a lighter or alcohol burner will probably put more bubbles in. A lot smaller, but it will probably burn or boil the wrap, and you've got to be really careful. I used to do it when I started 20 years ago. And the number of wraps I messed up because I had so many bubbles in there to get out, and I was licking it with this lighter flame, and then the next thing you know, either it catches fire or it just boils, and you've introduced more bubbles in. If you look at a lot of mass-produced rods, even the top brands, look very closely into the wraps and you will see bubbles. There's a very famous English mass producer, been going for almost 100 years, I should think. Probably the biggest rod maker in the world in its day. And the Chinese factory that make their rods obviously only put 1, possibly 2 coats of varnish on, but the threads aren't sealed when they put it on. They're probably using a brush, and there are millions of bubbles in all of in most of their wraps. I've never seen a rod without bubbles in the wraps. And because I'm working in a clean room, although I don't need to boil a kettle and go through that steam process, I've got away with 2 nice results. There is a third way, and the third way is it's not as good a material as this. It's perfectly acceptable. A rod builder friend of mine introduced me to it. Thanks, Big Phil. And it works. And in the background here, I varnished that 25 minutes ago. Only using 1 coat, and that is a sample of the varnish, and you can see how slowly it's running off that. It's almost set, and it's an American product, and it's called Bob Smith Industries 20-minute cure. It's a 2-part epoxy resin. It is tolerant to being mixed with isopropyl, and I dare say I was in a hurry to see if this would work, but I dare say had I mixed it a lot slower, I wouldn't have got as many bubbles in. I wouldn't have needed to have used as much isopropyl. And equally, had I let it rest, a lot of the bubbles will float to the surface. They won't quite pop, and I can just breathe on it like that, and then bang, they all come out. But I mixed it with approximately, it was 10 drops part A, 10 drops part B, and 25 drops of isopropyl. And I got it to a nice viscosity. It could do with another coat, but I expected that. But I just wanted to see how well it would work. And I would guess that it wouldn't be too laborious to do it by hand, because you probably only need to do it for an hour, and the thicker it gets, the less you need to turn it. So after, say, half an hour, you'd only need to turn it half a revolution once every 5 minutes, and then once every 10 minutes, and then once every 20 minutes, until it's solid enough to hold its own shape around the circumference of the blank. And yeah, I would be pleased to use that. The pot life on the Sensei is, especially mixed with isopropyl, about an hour. The pot life of that, I could feel it just starting to go hard, and I had to add a little bit more isopropyl. But it does solve the problem to the amateur rod builder who wants to try and build his or her first rods. And yeah, I'm chuffed. I actually use Bob Smith Industries to bond my reel seats, and well, not this one. I use the 5 minute. They do a 5 minute and a 12 minute, I think. Well, they certainly do a 15 minute. That's 15. I use it in the place of araldite just because it represents better value for the amount you get, and it's a good product. It dries rock hard, and they've got a variety in their range, and you can get them off eBay and Amazon. So there you are. Now all you've got to worry about is making sure that there isn't a draft in the room, because that will obviously start to fill up with dust again. Keep the doors shut, walk away, and don't come back. If you've got it on a turner, it's fine. Don't be tempted to come in and prod it to see if it's gone off, because obviously you'll just put a fingerprint on it. If you wanted to do this sort of litmus test approach of putting a spare amount on and then seeing how viscous it is, and I'm going to check that now. I mean, that's half as viscous as it was, or twice as viscous. Half as viscous? Twice as viscous? It's twice as thick as it was earlier. So yes, I'm pleased with that, and I think what I'd probably do in my workshop, because I use the Sensei, but for my top coats I use another product called Optimax, which is a very high gloss finish. I know a lot of people, when you talk to them about fly rods, run away when you say it's a high gloss finish. And it's ultraviolet, it's UV cured. So I get a couple of those coats on, or maybe in this case just one, and then I'll just put a cosmetic finish over that, and then take my specialist resin, which is UV cured resin specifically designed for rod building, and my Merhusiv torch, which runs at a massive 395 nanometer wavelength, and at 400 watts, and it'll cure that that wrap, even though it's quite thick, in next to no time at all. Probably 16 seconds. So if I'm not using the Sensei, or I've got somebody that wants a rod in a hurry or a repair, I can put a thin coat of the Optimax UV800 on, zap it with this unit, go straight onto a second coat, and it's cured. Brilliant for rod repairs. especially if somebody comes to the workshop and says, you know, can you do anything about this? Then we can do it while they wait, which is pretty good. The other strange thing about this is I tend to varnish at night. I like to varnish in artificial light, and the problem with varnishing using the ultraviolet UV varnish during the daytime is I've got a window just here, and the light comes through in the evening. So so as soon as it comes into contact with the UV varnish, then I'm scuppered and it starts to set. I'm utterly amazed, actually. We're on the top floor here in Marketplace in Selkirk. I can basically light up the back of the town with this unit. It is so powerful. I'm utterly amazed we haven't had a visit from the drug squad, because you really would think that somebody would, you know, somebody would see all this blue light coming out of these windows and, you know, make a telephone call, but I must all be on my side. Anyway, there you go. I hope that answers any questions. As I say, the Sensei varnish is available on eBay. My Bloke Rods website, blokerods.com, has my telephone number on it. If you have any problems or any questions or any queries, I'm happy to answer your call. Cheers.